Welcome back to another chilling episode of my horror podcast. I'm Jack, your guide into the darkest corners of the human experience. Tonight, I bring you a tale that will make you think twice before pulling over at that lonely roadside diner on your next long drive. It's the story of Paul McGrath, a young truck driver whose innocent pit stop turned into a horrifying encounter he would never forget. This isn't just any diner. It's one run by a strange old woman with a terrifying secret. What he discovered there is the stuff of nightmares, and by the end of this episode, you might just reconsider your late-night cravings. Let me ask you this. Have you ever stepped into a place and immediately felt like something was wrong? The air too heavy, the silence too loud, the smiles too fake. Now imagine that feeling, but instead of walking away, you stay. And what you uncover becomes the nightmare of your life. What happened to Paul at this creepy diner will chill you to the bone. Buckle up, folks. This one's not for the faint of heart. Our story takes us back to the summer of 1975, a time when highways were lonelier, radios crackled with static, and roadside payphones were a trucker's lifeline. Paul McGrath, a 20-year-old rookie truck driver, had just stepped into the family business. His father, a tough-as-nails war veteran, had scraped together enough money to buy a second-hand truck. It wasn't much, but for the McGraths, it was a start, a ticket to something better. Paul wasn't just a driver, he was a dreamer. But out on those desolate highways, dreams were drowned out by the hum of the engine, the rattle of loose gravel under his tires, and the oppressive silence of the night. That particular summer, Paul was tasked with a grueling job, delivering gravel and sand to a road construction site deep in the forests of Montana. The project site was as isolated as they come, miles from the nearest town, surrounded by thick woods, and connected only by narrow, twisting dirt roads. It wasn't just the isolation that got to Paul, it was the stories. Fellow truckers, seasoned veterans of the road, had spoken in hushed tones about drivers disappearing in that region. Eerie sightings, unexplainable sounds. Most shrugged them off as tall tales, but a few swore they'd seen things they couldn't explain. Paul spent most of his time in his truck. It wasn't luxurious, but it was home. A tiny metal cocoon with a creaky cot, a hot plate for cooking, and a stack of crumpled maps. His days were long and monotonous, punctuated by the occasional static-ridden song on the radio. At night, he parked his truck by the roadside, cooked simple meals of canned beans and toast, and drifted off to sleep in the cab. But those nights weren't always peaceful. The forest had a way of amplifying every sound, the snapping of twigs, the distant howl of a wolf, or the eerie rustling of leaves in the wind. And then there were the stories, whispers of ghostly figures on the road, trucks abandoned without a trace, and shadowy shapes lurking just out of sight. Paul tried to shake them off, but every creak and groan of his truck felt like a reminder. Something out here wasn't quite right. The stage was set. Paul was about to find out that some stories aren't just tales, they're warnings. And this job would lead him straight into the heart of one of those warnings. It was a little past midnight when Paul was jolted awake by a sharp knock on his truck's door. Startled, he sat up, his heart pounding in the stillness of the night. The knock came again, this time louder and more urgent. Grabbing his flashlight, Paul hesitated for a moment before cautiously rolling down the window. The beam of his flashlight landed on a man, mid-30s, thin and disheveled, with a sunburned face and tattered clothes that looked like they had seen better days. The man's eyes were wide, darting nervously as if he were being followed. "Hey, sorry to bother you," the man said, his voice shaky and hoarse. "I need some water. I've been walking for miles, ate something spicy at the diner up the road and, well, you know." Paul blinked. Diner? What diner? He'd been driving up and down this stretch of road for days and hadn't seen anything resembling a diner. Just trees, dirt, and more trees. "A diner?" Paul asked, narrowing his eyes. "There's nothing out here but forest." The man nodded vigorously. "No, it's there. A little shack down a dirt road, run by an old lady. She makes this chili. It's to die for, but man, I think I overdid it. Please, just a little water." Paul handed him a bottle of water, watching as the man gulped it down with a desperation that made Paul uneasy. When the bottle was empty, the man handed it back, muttered a quick thank you, and disappeared into the darkness without another word. Paul sat there, staring at the empty road where the man had vanished, his mind racing. The next morning, the strange encounter still gnawed at Paul. He couldn't shake the man's frantic demeanor or the odd detail about a diner he'd never seen. Curiosity got the better of him. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest was bathed in shadows, Paul decided to investigate. Following the man's vague description, he turned his truck down a narrow dirt path he'd previously overlooked. The road was rough, barely wide enough for his vehicle, and seemed to twist endlessly into the woods. Finally, after what felt like miles, he saw it. Nestled in the darkness was a small wooden shack, its peeling paint barely visible in the dim light of his truck's headlights. A faded sign above the door read, "Maggie's Diner." Paul parked his truck and killed the engine, the oppressive silence of the forest immediately settling around him. As he stared at the shack, a strange feeling crept over him. Unease, curiosity, and something he couldn't quite name. The man's words echoed in his head. Run by an old lady. Chilly to die for. Paul took a deep breath, grabbed his flashlight, and stepped out of the truck. Whatever this place was, he was about to find out. Paul decided to satisfy his curiosity. He left his truck at the main road and ventured down the narrow dirt path the stranger had mentioned. The walk was unnervingly quiet, the dense forest around him shrouded in shadows. The usual chorus of crickets and rustling leaves was absent, replaced by an unsettling stillness. Paul froze. A new sensation overtook him, an aroma wafting through the trees. It was warm, rich, and savory, an enticing blend of roasted spices and smoky meat that made his mouth water despite his growing unease. The smell seemed to guide him, compelling him forward. Then, through the trees, he saw it, a dimly lit shack, its wooden exterior barely visible under the glow of a flickering lantern hanging by the door. The sign above read Maggie's Diner, its faded letters almost blending into the wood. Paul hesitated, his heart pounding, before stepping onto the creaky porch. The door creaked open before Paul could knock. An old woman stood there, her frame heavy set and her face wrinkled with age. She wore a stained apron that looked as though it hadn't been washed in weeks, and her graying hair was pulled back in a messy bun. But it was her smile that unsettled Paul the most, wide and peculiar, as if it were trying too hard to be inviting. "Welcome, dear," she exclaimed, her voice warm but carrying an odd edge. Come in, you must be hungry." Paul hesitated but stepped inside. The shack's interior was small and dimly lit by a single oil lamp. A wooden counter and a few mismatched chairs completed the decor. The smell of food was stronger now, almost intoxicating, but Paul couldn't help noticing a faint metallic undertone beneath the rich aroma. The old woman set a simple meal in front of him, freshly baked bread and a side of greens. "It's not much, but it's made with love," she said with a chuckle. "Tomorrow, though, I'll make you something special. My meat stew. It's what everyone comes back for." Paul thanked her and began eating, the food surprisingly delicious despite its humble presentation. But as he ate, he couldn't take his eyes off the old woman's hands. They were large, with thick fingers, and stained a deep red. Not like the typical discoloration from kitchen work, but something darker, almost sinister. Big hands for someone her size, Paul thought. He quickly dismissed the idea, convincing himself it was just beet juice or some kind of spice. The woman sat across from him, watching him eat with that same peculiar smile, her eyes glinting in the flickering light. As Paul finished his meal, the old woman leaned forward. "You'll come back tomorrow night, won't you? I'd love to make my special meat just for you." Paul nodded, unsure why he agreed. Something about the way she spoke made it feel less like an invitation and more like a command. He left the diner with a full stomach but a gnawing unease. The woman's strange smile burned into his memory. The walk back to his truck was even quieter than before, the forest around him feeling suffocating and alive, as if unseen eyes were watching his every step. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had walked into something he shouldn't have, but what exactly he didn't yet know. Despite his unease, Paul found himself drawn back to Maggie's diner the next evening. Hunger gnawed at him, but it was more than that. The strange allure of the place was like a thread pulling him in. The old woman greeted him with the same peculiar smile, her stained apron now replaced with a slightly cleaner one. "Ah, you've come back. I've prepared something extra special for you tonight," she said with excitement, motioning for him to sit at the same wooden table. Moments later, she placed a steaming plate in front of him. The aroma was intoxicating, rich, smoky, and savory. The meat was tender and practically melted in his mouth with every bite. It was, without question, the best meal Paul had ever eaten. "This is amazing," Paul said between bites. "What kind of meat is this?" The old lady's strange smile widened, her eyes glinting in the dim light. "Goat," she said softly, pausing for effect. "Special goat." Something about the way she said it made Paul's stomach turn slightly, but the flavor was so irresistible that he dismissed his discomfort and continued eating. As Paul savored his meal, he began to notice things he hadn't the night before. The shack was eerily quiet, with no sounds of clinking pots or pans, despite the elaborate dish she had served. There were still no other customers yet. Outside the window, he saw piles of bones, large, jagged, and weathered as if they'd been there for years. Even stranger wild animals, raccoons, foxes, and even a pair of coyotes, skulked in the shadows near the shack. They seemed unnaturally bold, their glowing eyes fixed on the diner as if drawn to something they couldn't resist. Paul's unease grew, but he said nothing. The old woman hovered nearby, watching him eat with that unsettling grin plastered on her face. As soon as he finished, she cleared the table with surprising speed and offered him a cup of tea. "You must be tired," she said. "You can rest here if you'd like. The forest can be dangerous at night." Paul declined, his instincts screaming at him to leave. But something stopped him. A nagging curiosity, an urge to uncover the truth about the strange diner and the even stranger woman who ran it. While the old lady busied herself in the back, Paul took his chance. His curiosity outweighed his fear, and he quietly slipped behind a curtain that led to a small storage area. What he saw froze him in place. The room was dimly lit by a single buzzing light bulb, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. A large wooden table stood in the center, stained with dark, dried blood. Bloody knives of various sizes were scattered across its surface, alongside cleavers and a saw. On the floor were chunks of unrecognizable meat, some still fresh and glistening under the light. But it was the piles of clothing that made Paul's blood run cold. Torn, blood-stained shirts, pants, and boots all heaped in a corner. Among them was a tattered plaid shirt, identical to the one worn by the man who had directed Paul to the diner. Paul's stomach churned as he realized the truth. This wasn't goat meat. This wasn't even animal meat. The special goat the old lady had spoken of was something far more horrifying. A creak behind him made Paul whirl around. The old woman stood in the doorway, her face no longer smiling. Her eyes gleamed with a predatory hunger, and in her hand she held a large butcher's knife. Paul's heart pounded as he took a step back, the grisly scene behind him burning into his memory. He had to get out of there, now. Paul's breath quickened as he backed away from the gruesome sight behind the curtain. The old lady's shadow loomed larger as she stepped closer, her cleaver glinting in the dim light. "Leaving already?" she said in a disturbingly calm tone, tilting her head. "You didn't even thank me for the meal." Paul forced himself to breathe slowly, masking his fear with a shaky smile. "Of course. Thank you, it was delicious," he stammered, inching toward the exit. She didn't move from the doorway, her unnerving smile returning. "You're welcome, but I insist you stay for dessert." The tension was suffocating, and Paul knew he had only seconds to act. Desperately scanning the room, he noticed a jar on the counter nearby and grabbed it, hurling it toward the old lady. The glass shattered against the wall, momentarily startling her. Without wasting another second, Paul bolted out the door and into the dark forest. The forest was pitch black, the narrow dirt path barely visible under the faint moonlight. Paul's legs burned as he sprinted, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. He could hear her behind him, her heavy footsteps crunching on the gravel, accompanied by a low guttural hum of a tune she had been singing earlier in the diner. His mind raced. He knew he couldn't outrun her forever. Spotting a cluster of dense bushes, Paul dove into them, muffling his breath as he crouched low. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped just a few feet away. "You can't hide forever," she called out, her voice eerily playful. "I'll find you. I always do." Paul waited, his entire body trembling, as her footsteps eventually faded into the distance. Once he was sure she was gone, he scrambled out of the bushes and made a beeline for his truck. The sight of it in the distance filled him with a surge of hope. Paul reached his truck, flung open the door, and jumped inside. Locking the doors, he jammed the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine sputtered for what felt like an eternity before roaring to life. As he sped down the desolate highway, his rearview mirror revealed no sign of the old woman or the diner. He didn't stop driving until he reached the nearest town, where he burst into the local sheriff's office and recounted his harrowing experience. The authorities were skeptical but agreed to investigate. When they arrived at the location Paul described, all they found were the charred remnants of a structure, barely recognizable as a shack. Scattered among the ashes were bones, both human and animal, but no sign of the old lady. Paul never returned to that area again. The memory of the diner haunted his dreams, the old woman's strange smile and the taste of the meat forever etched into his mind. Even now, decades later, Paul warns fellow truckers to trust their instincts and avoid stopping at places that feel wrong. Because sometimes a seemingly innocent meal can lead you straight into the jaws of a nightmare. So, what do you think? Was the old lady real, or was she something far more sinister, something otherworldly? And the meat Paul tasted that night, was it really goat, or was it something unthinkable? Perhaps it's better that some questions remain unanswered. But one thing's for certain. Paul's story serves as a chilling reminder that not every place on the map is safe to explore. Sometimes the most unassuming stops hide the darkest secrets. If this spine-chilling tale kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and hit that subscribe button for more horrifying stories that will make your blood run cold. And here's a question for you. Would you have dared to eat at that diner? Or would your instincts have told you to run the other way? Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, stay safe out there, keep your lights on, and remember, some roads are better left untraveled